Hello and welcome to this video on how to best use your Berkeley Review books. My name is Todd Bennett. I'm the author of the General Chemistry and Organic Chemistry books. Started writing them back in 1992 when we first started this course. Also, the author of the physics books, starting around 20 years ago. And welcome. Just want to take this time to just explain what you should be doing with your books. Also let you know I'll be the teacher for your class for the chemistry and physics. And so there'll be plenty of time. If I don't explain something well in this video, please ask before lecture, after class, email me during office hours, contact me, somehow reach out. But you really want to get a good idea of what you're doing with the books before you start into them. And so for a lot of you, they've just recently been delivered. You open this box and it's this massive pile of books. And quite frankly, everybody stresses out. They look very thick, they look very intimidating, and the reality is this: you may only need around 60% of what's in that book. Meaning, there's questions you're going to get right, you don't need to go through the answer explanation because you know it really well. There's topics you know really well, you don't need to do the reading, you can just skim or jump into passages and learn from questions. So do not get overwhelmed because they're designed to cover everything for somebody who doesn't know anything or is so far removed from it where they can work from scratch and build their way up. If you know something well, it won't be as daunting. So I want to give you an inside look at what the philosophy was behind writing the passages, the questions, the material, and just let you know, no question is in the book, no passage is in the book by accident. For every passage and question you see, there's 2 to 3 that were thrown away and not put in the book. And so there's a very specific reason to it, and it's how we're going to learn to do well in the MCAT. So with that in mind, how to get the most out of your books, I'm going to explain the 4 parts of the book, the review, and then homework phase 1, 2, and 3, and how those fit in. And then also philosophically what we're aiming at. And so I want to start with a learning curve. My personal favorite of all the learning curves I've ever seen was developed by 2 psychology researchers in the early 2000s, Dunning and Kruger. And what they did is they studied a series of people. In some instances, they show them a video how something works, and then another instance, they had a teacher teaching them, showing them how something works. Another case, they read about it and for 2 pages on this concept. And they did a survey of how well they felt like they knew it and if they were confident enough to go in and apply these skills. And they did that. And then they found when they either quizzed them or if it was a skill, if they made them go and do the task that they just watched, they discovered very quickly they really didn't know it. And so this learning curve says that you can get exposed to material. You're going to think you really, really know it, but it isn't until you start working with it that you discover you don't know it that well. But once you get over that emotional drop, that being beaten up by not knowing it, if you keep on pounding away at it and keep on practicing, you climb up the learning curve, and eventually you will hopefully get to a point where you are in that 510, 515, 520 range at the top of that curve, where high confidence and guru status happen. And so just want to go through this. The climb initially is the content review, the basic review. Over the years, I've watched people study for this, both in our course and in other programs, some of their own, just interactions with different people. And I will say, without a doubt, the biggest mistake people make when studying is they overemphasize content review. You really only need to put in 10% of your time in content review. The other 90% should be spent practicing and working on questions, because when you do questions, you are doing content review. You're doing active, applied content review, and you're actually learning it better. You're learning to integrate. You're learning it in context. You're learning how that information can be used, not just learning it. So for all the people who focus on making Anki decks, watching a lot of con videos or videos from whatever resource, there's some great videos out there, but it's not what you should be doing. It's too passive. It's just being information given to you, and it doesn't help. You have to pay your dues. And this is where the homework phases come in. So homework phase 1, it's meant to just cover content. This is your active, your applied content review. A lot of the questions here will be just what is an oxidation state or what is a pH? It's fairly straightforward in the sense that they're not convoluted. They're not questions that make you interpret things from graphs necessarily. It's just, do you know your content? This section, we want you to go through slowly and methodically and do it as soon as you can after lecture so that the information hits home, the information stays with you. Homework phase 2, this is where you start worrying more about skills. This is where you actually worry about timing. Phase 1, do it without a clock. But phase 2, definitely try to finish under an allotted time limit. In this, there'll be a lot more conceptual questions, a lot more questions where two answer choices look really close to one another. There'll be answer choices that are completely true, but they don't answer the question. Things that are notorious for making you read them a second time or go slowly, or things that eat up your allotted time. Your job is to get very effective at spending your time wisely. So for instance, going through a passage, you hopefully will discover early on, you don't need to thoroughly read it and thoroughly understand it, because if you spend all your time doing that, just thoroughly going over it, there's going to be things you go over that they don't ask questions on. There's stuff in their passages, material in their passages, that you're never going to be asked about as you're taking their test, as you're going through their questions. So spending too much time on passages and overthinking what they could ask you, we do it. That's just instinctive for a lot of us. It's not the best use of time. And hopefully that's one of the things you learn from phase 2. Finally, phase 3, this will be the most MCAT realistic of everything we do. This is where every passage, or nearly every passage, integrates multiple topics from multiple disciplines. So for instance, you might be doing a passage on titration, and one of the questions asks, in this electrophoresis path, this protein, which migrates from the well to wherever it finishes, you might say, okay, 2/3 down this pathway, at what point does that correspond to on the titration curve? It sounds like a really weird question, something you've never been asked before, something weird and out of context, combining titration curves and electrophoresis in a way that you just haven't done. But you'll learn from that question that it's actually a pretty simple question. It's just a really weird, it's hard in that its wording is tough, but the concept is pretty simple. You look at the pH on the electrophoresis, you figure out where that is, match it to titration curve, and you're done. But it's unnerving at first, and you have to go through this. You have to learn from these sorts of experiences so that when it comes time to take the MCAT, you don't freak out. You just systematically say, okay, weird question, it feels hard at first, but there's something simple here. Find the simple thing. Once you've done all the homework, then it's time to start applying it to full-length tests. AAMC exams, AAMC materials, our full-length exams. You want to hone your craft. You're going to hear me say something repeatedly over the duration of the course, and that is, through all this, you're writing a note to future self. And what I mean by that is, through all this homework you're doing, I want you to keep notes, and just not really cumbersome notes, maybe 3, 4, 5 pages for the different sections, and things that you want to remind yourself to think about on that test, little tricks, little strategies at work, some mnemonic, anything that you think is important. Keep this ongoing list, and before you do your first full-length exam, read this. Spend your time, 10, 15 minutes going over it, review it, go take the exam. After the exam, modify, cross some things out, add some new stuff to it. Make this an ongoing thing, make it a living document, and I'm going to call it Note to Future Self. Then, on the day of your MCAT, about a half hour before you are going to go into the center, sit and read the content of it. Spend that time looking at it, the things that matter and help you on the test. Go in confident with that stuff fresh in your mind. So you're basically writing a note to future self. And it sounds funny, but that's exactly what you're doing. Then, in the future, thank previous self. Last but not least, you should spend your last 2, 3, 4 days or so doing nothing but just a complete overview of everything you know. Inventory your mind. Make sure you know certain content, certain equations. Refamiliarize with some of the shortcuts and tricks. So let's say it's been a month and a half since a light and optics lecture where we go over, when we go over mirrors and lenses, the way we're going to teach it is different from school and built exclusively for doing multiple choice questions very quickly. And it's the best technique you'll ever do for this because it's designed specifically for this. It's a systematic way of deciding whether it's a single lens, single mirror, or a complex system, whether it's diverging and converging, and if it is diverging, what you do. If it's converging, where's the object, where's the radius of curvature, where's the focal length. Once you figure these things out, you can very quickly determine what type of image and where the image is located. Once you get this down pat, again, you want to review it so that it feels fresh going into the exam. So there's your learning curve. You have to climb it. You have to go through the review. You have to get beaten up on the homework. Average person's going to get 56% right on homework phase 1. They're going to get about 62% right on phase 2. They're going to get about 67% right on phase 3. These numbers will make you feel terrible about how it's going. And reality is, this is completely by design so that you read through the answer explanations, so that you learn, so that you climb this curve. Do not be afraid to make mistakes in practice because they'll help you to not make mistakes when it comes time for the actual test. Climb the curve, get to that point where you're 510, 515, 520, get to that high point on that curve. Okay, so I actually want to look at the books themselves. So how do you get the most out of it? Like I mentioned, 4 parts: the review, homework phase 1, homework phase 2, and homework phase 3. Those are going to be the 4 parts. The review, the content, read through it as you need it, but if you know something well, like let's say PV equals nRT or Le Chatelier's principle, it's not worth reading those 2 to 3 pages. It's just going to waste time because you already got it in high school, you relearned it in college. It's in there. Reading it isn't going to change that. But make sure you do the embedded questions on it, practice applying the information, but read only what you need. So that little bolded segment right there, most important part, read only what you need. Don't read stuff you know really well. Time is precious. Like I mentioned, there's embedded questions. I'm going to show that in a sample in a slide down the road. But that's the first part, review. Second part, phase 1. Want to emphasize 2 things here. Number 1, you want to do it as soon as you can after lecture. You want to jump right into it so that it goes from short term to long term. So you can apply the stuff from lecture and just hone it in. So always try to plan to have an extra hour and a half to 2 hours after lecture to sit and do this homework phase 1. You'll also notice it's untimed. You just want to go through it, want to learn from it. So the suggestion here is when you first do the passage, do it in pencil, let's say, or black ink or something that you'll know is the first time going through it. Completely go through all the questions. Don't stop and grade midway. Do all 25 questions. Then when you're done, set it down, walk away for a few minutes, come back and open up the answers. Don't read the answer explanations, just look at the letters. And with a blue pen, mark everything you got wrong. And then go back and try those questions again. Now, obviously, one of the answers isn't correct anymore. There's only 3 answer choices to go. Do it again, writing notes of everything you're thinking. You always want to do this. Make sure you write first time what your thoughts are because you're not grading the answer, you're grading your thought process. That's what you're owning in. Write it in blue, and then go back. Now, grade it again, read the answer explanations, and anything you got wrong, write what you learned from the answer explanation in red on that page. And what this tells you, when you step back at the end of doing these 3 cycles through this passage, if it's all in pencil, great. You know the stuff really well, and you're good at test taking on that subject. If it's a lot of blue, you know the subject well because you were able to get it right without reviewing the answer explanation. So it's clearly you know it, but maybe it's test taking. Maybe it's skills, maybe it's focus, maybe it's interpreting. Something that has to be worked on. And if it's red, probably that's where you have to worry about content. That's usually where you might have been missing it because you don't remember a certain amount of information. But take advantage of this color-coordinated scheme of doing homework to really figure out how to be a better test taker, how to know your material more effectively, how to answer questions more systematically. Homework phase 2, this is the one you want to do a few days, no later than a week after phase 1, but no sooner than 2 days. You want to give yourself a little bit of time to forget so that it simulates the MCAT a little bit better. Homework phase 2 questions will feel different than phase 1. Phase one, a lot of it is you know it or you don't. Oxidation states, you have to identify it, identify what's happening in some titration, for instance, just basically face value type questions. Phase two starts to incorporate more, I guess, extrapolation. From this concept, how can we look at another new situation? It might have answer choices that look very similar to one another, things that typically waste a lot of time. It will have a bunch of extraneous information in the passage that you don't really need, things that, again, typically waste time. You're timing yourself on phase two, and as a consequence, you want to make sure you're being time efficient. So this section of the homework, again, it emphasizes material, but it does it with more conceptual questions, things you really have to stop and think about. You have to practice focusing and getting very quick at picking a choice, being happy with it, and moving on. Most people at first will not be finishing these on time. You'll get better and better as you focus on it. But it's a major part of the learning. Phase one, content. Phase two, quickness and skills. And then finally, phase three, the homework. And this is where I sort of diverge a little bit. The GChem and the physics book, phase three are actually practice tests at the end of the chapter. For the OChem book, I've made it's an actual distinct phase three at the end of each chapter. It's similar in the sense that in phase threes, whether it's a practice test or the actual phase three of OChem, that it mixes things together. You'll notice a lot more experiments in this, a lot more machinery, a lot more devices. You'll notice a lot more bio being integrated into the physics of GChem and the OChem. This is where we best simulate what's going to happen on your MCAT, where you have to actually apply it to new situations related to bio. For this one, again, you want to worry about timing, but the most important thing here is mastering your test skills, learning how to apply this information, learning how to read tables, graphs, and charts. It's the big picture on this one, figuring out what's minutia and what's important. And so I want to spend a little bit of time showing you exactly what the pages are. Hopefully that'll knock this message home. But again, the review portion, this is the first thing you're going to do. Typically, students will read or skim before lecture. Your sequence, whatever you choose to do, figure out what's best for you, but it's recommended, at least at first, try reviewing or skimming before lecture and let lecture help build this pool of information. But for instance, this is a page out of the GChem book. It's the first page in the general chemistry, electrochemistry section. And you'll notice the top part is how to get oxidation states, and it might be slightly different than what you learned in school. So in school, you were given a formula, you learned to assign, let's say, a +1 to a hydrogen, except in certain cases, -2 at oxygen, again, except in certain cases like peroxide or molecular oxygen. And then you got another atom by default. This goes from a formula approach into a structural approach. So you draw the structure out in this case, and you figure out which atom is more electronegative. The more electronegative atom gets a negative, the less electronegative gets a positive. You add up the negatives and positives that it gets from all the bonds, and that's its oxidation state. It's a different way of doing it, and it's generally a little more effective because you don't have to memorize a bunch of random facts for hydrides and hydrogen and oxygen and oxides and so forth. But it takes a little while to get used to it. Notice on the left-hand side here, there's about a 2-inch wide space below the word general chemistry that runs the length of the page. This is for taking notes. Know early on, these books are workbooks, not textbooks. You are meant to write in these. You're meant to learn from these. There'll be occasionally a note that we put in there, like some test-taking tip or strategy. Make note of these. This is what you want to write so that when you look back on it maybe a few months later, you know that, there's a trick on this, here's a trick on that. So take advantage of that space. You'll notice at the bottom there's a question. We have embedded questions in the text to make you apply the information, to learn it. Some people just do the embedded questions and then skim back through what the precursor reading was if they struggle with that question. Another good way to go through the books. You make the call what's best for you. Are you a reader, a skimmer, or somebody who tries questions and works backwards? Few things that are universally true. Try to take minimal notes. You really don't have to have a lot of notes on this material. And keep an ongoing list of useful tricks. Again, that note to future self, something that will help you in the future. Sample of phase 1. Chose this one from the organic chemistry book. You'll notice the passage looks like a bio passage. A lot of times this is what they do. They have a biomolecule, a bioprocess, but then they ask you OChem questions about the molecules that are involved. So this is a pretty typical style of passage they'll write. You'll notice question 15, again, it's a content. It's a straightforward, what is an oxidation state? Just look at it and see, analyze what the numbers are. The next question, 16, what is a reducing agent? These are fundamental concept questions. That's what's going to be emphasized in phase 1. A few things, again, do not worry about timing. It's how well you grasp material that matters right now. Second, you want to get really good habits. I liken it to learning a dance. If any of you ever had to learn to dance at some point in your life, you typically start out by working on your footwork. You very slowly, methodically count out 16 steps at a time what your feet should be doing. Once you get that down pat, then you add to the rest of your body motion, what it's supposed to be doing. Then you pick up the pace, add in music, you personalize it, and you systematically go and learn to dance this way. Getting ready for the MCAT, learning the MCAT dance, if you will, is no different. Want you in this section to not worry about timing, go really slow, literally count your steps, count what you're doing on each question. So you're grading not whether you got things right or wrong, but how you got them right or how you got them wrong, how systematic you were. So cross things out, write when you cross something out, eliminated because of this, eliminated because of that. Grade your approach to the question as much as the result. Last but not least, got to learn from the answer explanations. Your answer explanations will teach you more than anything as far as studying for the MCAT goes. Phase 2. Phase 2, again, as mentioned, more time consuming. You want to keep track of time, but I may have gone a little overboard by having more conceptual questions. You have to actually really think your way through it. And then the passages are generally going to be a little bit longer and a little bit more information intensive. So notice this one has 3 different equations. The continuity equation, A1V1 equals A2V2, describes how things flow through a narrowing or widening pipe, what happens with branching and so forth. The second one, Poiseuille's law of fluid flow rate, Q, how much volume of fluid moves in a certain amount of time in the variables that affect it. A typical question might be how you apply it. So if this factor changed and that factor changed, what behavior would we expect? So for instance, if you had an increase in cardiac output, so let's say your systolic and diastolic pressures, the difference between those two goes up, what would happen to the volume flow rate? So it's like, can you apply it to a situation? Can you use the equation to support your predictions? And then the last equation there, Reynolds number, tells me how laminar, how streamlined or smooth fluid is flowing. And then as that number goes up, it starts to become more chaotic, more randomized, if you will. So turbulent flow has a high Reynolds number, laminar flow has a low Reynolds number. And we can apply that, for instance, blood flow, like what's being discussed here. Okay, keep track of time and emphasize being quick but not in a hurry. Don't waste time, but same token, be thorough. Number 2, you got to focus on skills at this point. So master process elimination, master recognition of what's different and what's the same in questions, and get good at conceptual. Get good at figuring out how to apply this information in new situations. Finally, the third phase of homework, and as I mentioned, G-Chem and physics is a little bit different in that it has to do with practice tests that integrate different materials. So for instance, this comes from the G-Chem book. You'll notice, you see burettes right away. It's a titration passage, but it's also, if you look below it, a circuits passage. There's a circuit in there, and you're going to go through this passage and also discover eventually that it deals with salts, dissociation, so it's solubility as well. They start mixing things together. Our most realistic passages, the ones that are most MCAT-like, are phase 3. So you go through the first 2 phases. You go through the first one that's content-driven, not as MCAT realistic. Go through the second one, which is timing, cumbersome information, a lot of conceptual questions, not as MCAT realistic. But when you get to phase 3, these are where you integrate everything. All the skills, the content you learned, and the skills you learned in phases 1 and 2 come to fruition. A lot of these will be applied information, and interpreting data, this is what you have to ultimately get really good at. By the time you finish this, then you're ready to start looking at double AMC material, because they will have a lot of experiments. They will have a lot of data interpretation. They will have a lot of tables to process. So you're going to get, hopefully, better and better as you go through this. Do not start into these, at least for GChem and physics, until you finish the book completely. So again, these are set up as practice tests. Now, practice test 1 will emphasize material from chapter 1. Practice test 2 will emphasize material from chapter 2, but it will include everything from all 6 chapters in that book. So book 1, practice test is based on book 1. Book 2, practice test is based on book 2. Do these, you'll end up forgetting a lot of stuff. That's all part of the process. When you do it here, that second contact learning, that reaffirmation that you know it, will be incredibly beneficial. Few things: focus on processing information in the passage quickly and effectively. Don't overthink. Know where to zero in. So in this case, if you look at this passage, hopefully you've gotten really good to the point where your first thing you're going to do is look at that picture and try to figure out what the heck is going on in it. Then the second thing you'll do is look at the table and notice that the salt and the conductivity are somehow correlated. What we're mixing together, somehow correlated. Okay, the second thing, reverse engineer the questions. When you're going over this, when you're reviewing the answer explanations, look and see, are there certain answer choices put in there that are deceptive, almost trick-like? Are there certain ones that are common careless errors? Are there certain ones that are just there to emphasize a trend? Is there something about the answer choice that's right that doesn't fit within the pattern of the ones that are wrong? Start doing an analysis of how answer choices are written, and what you'll discover, the more you know about how a test is written, the better you can do on that test. For anybody who's ever tutored or TA'd, I'm sure you learned you understand the material way better when you teach it, because you have to explain it from different perspectives. You have to think about it in a deeper level. Same thing with test writing. If you've ever had to write a test, in this case a multiple choice test, it's really hard to write wrong answers, and you start finding ways to do it. You start have targeted wrong answers that you think people might pick by mistake. When you start recognizing the mistakes they expect people to make, the better you will be at navigating those little landmines in the test. So last but not least, when you finish this, you're going to take the information you learned from the first 3 phases of homework, you're going to hone in that letter to future self, and you're going to have it ready for your full lengths and for your double AMC material to constantly reference. This ongoing sheet of things that you feel you should know, that's a major part of review. It's content reaffirmation, it's skills reaffirmation, it's making sure that these things don't drift and fall into the background. So, again, want to say thank you so much for being a part of our class. I look forward to meeting you in lecture soon. If you stick to this, the plan is really as simple as do a ton of questions and learn something different from each of these questions about skills, about content, about how to do well in the MCAT. If you do this, you get great scores. I mean, we're incredibly proud of our scores. I've had a top 1% MCAT score every year I've ever done this. And well, not just one, multiple. Our students get really good scores because they pay their dues and they're very smart in the way they apply the information. Follow this pathway, you'll do really, really well. So I look forward to meeting you, and thanks so much for sitting through this. Have an absolutely wonderful day.